Let's go to Jerusalem and correspondent to Irris Makler. Irris, what's the latest?
The very latest is that Israel reports that about an hour ago, it hit what it calls a Hamas intelligence center inside the Gaza Strip with dozens of Hamas operatives inside. It's not clear how many have been killed. I'd say that probably is an accurate description because within minutes there has been a barrage of rockets. I mean, it has just been relentless for the past hour in the south. In Beersheba, if you're listening to one of the stations that tells you when the sirens are happening, it is never ending. So I'd say that's the very latest. There are Israeli troops at the border. Israel's military has said it's preparing plans for a ground offensive, a sea offensive, an air offensive, and it's presenting them to the politicians. I think that's a little bit performative. I'm sure they have got those plans, but it's the fact that they're letting us know publicly. We heard from Hamas earlier in the day that they had sent a rocket, the longest range rocket they have ever fired, more than 200 kilometres all the way down to Eilat, where they were hoping to hit the airport that is there. So I think that's a little bit performative too. There's a lot of tough talking, but the tough talking has brought out the diplomats, and the diplomats are heading here. There's an Egyptian delegation here. Washington is sending an envoy, and I think that parallel track is beginning to operate now.
And do we know more about that diplomacy?
We know they're here, and we know that in the past it has only been diplomacy. It's only been an umpire tearing the two fighters apart that has done it. In the past, it always was the Egyptians who are the traditional mediators. We know that Qatar also, there's a direct line to Qatar. They are very closely related to Hamas, presenting them with a lot of funds as well, supporting them financially. We know there's been some tough words from the UN and the EU and separate European governments. So I would say that all of that, plus the Washington envoy, the new Israel-Palestine Middle East envoy, Hadi Amr, I think all of those things together will begin the process. It isn't immediate. From past experience, it takes a few days. Sometimes there are truces and then they fall by the wayside. But in the end, that's the only thing that actually tears these two apart.
Irris, as night falls, what does it look like inside of Israel right now after we've seen these unprecedented clashes between Israeli Arabs and Jews?
Yes, I know that the police are gearing up for a third night, and I've been monitoring social media. And you can see that it's not just homegrown. What we've seen is that in towns like, let's take Lod, because there was a state of emergency declared there last night after what happened 2 nights ago. But in that town, it isn't just the locals who live side by side, sometimes in the same street, sometimes in the same building. There are people who come from the outside. There are Arab groups who come from the outside. There are right-wing Israeli groups, and they are now working on social media, saying you've got to come to protect the Jews of Lod. You've got to come to protect the Arabs of Lod. So all those people are trying to pile in. The police are trying to keep them out, and they're anticipating a third night of clashes between the two populations, which do lead to very violent scenes, including Arab groups turning on one Jewish man and beating him, and the same we saw in the town of Akko in the north of Israel, but in reverse. It was Jewish groups turning on an Arab man. So that's what we see, and that's what the police fear for tonight.
And speaking to people where you are, Irris, I mean, what's the bigger preoccupation? We've seen regular intervals where there's been wars between Israel and Gaza. Are people more concerned about the possibility of that ground invasion we talked about, that possible ground invasion we talked about, or what you've just described now, this fighting between Israeli Arabs and hardline Jews?
I think most of the people I've spoken to and most of the articles that I've read, I think it's the shock of this, that second one, the fighting, the internal fighting. The mayor of Lod actually went on the radio today and said, this is, we are on the brink of civil war. And the thought of that really does frighten Israelis and preoccupy Israelis. I think they're more used, as you say, to wars with Gaza. They're not used to a civil war.
Irris Makler reporting live there from Jerusalem. And of course, we'll have more on this in the France 24 debate that's coming up in a little over 1 hour's time. In Afghanistan,